These are easy to fake, so why don't you tell me the truth? Where'd you really get this? Officer Carter?
I am a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I have served for 12 years.
The Texas sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the cracked asphalt of Highway 87. It was the kind of heat that baked the color out of the sky, leaving a pale, indifferent blue. Lieutenant Michael Corrigan felt it through the air conditioning of his Ford F-150, a low hum in the background of his thoughts. 12 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him to endure climates far worse than this, but today, the heat felt personal, suffocating. He was driving home to the quiet West Texas town he'd left as a teenager, home to see his father for what the doctors said would be the last time. The truck was anonymous. No military decals, no patriotic bumper stickers. His service was a part of him, not a billboard. In the passenger seat, a simple duffel bag held a fresh uniform, his dress blues, for the funeral he knew was coming. He hadn't worn them in years. He was less than 30 miles from his parents' house when the flashing lights filled his rearview mirror, red and blue strobing against the bleached landscape. Corrigan's training kicked in instantly, a calm, methodical checklist running through his mind. Check mirrors, signal, pull over smoothly to the shoulder, engine off, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Wait. He watched in the mirror as a state trooper's cruiser, clean and white, pulled in behind him. The officer took his time, a deliberate slowness that Corrigan recognized as a tactic to assert control. Finally, the car door opened, and a young trooper stepped out. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of rigid posture that came from the academy, not experience. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his jaw was set, a tight line of authority. Corrigan rolled his window down, the blast of hot air a stark contrast to the cool cab. "Good afternoon, officer," he said, his voice even. "License and registration," the trooper said. No greeting, just a command. His name tag read, Carter. "Yes, sir." Corrigan moved slowly, narrating his actions. "My wallet is in my back pocket. The registration is in the glove box." He retrieved the documents with deliberate care and passed them over. Officer Carter took them, his eyes scanning the driver's license, then the registration. Everything was in order. Michael Corrigan, age 34, address in Virginia Beach near his base. The truck was registered in his name. A clean record. "You rolled through that stop sign back there, Mr. Corrigan," Carter said, his tone flat. Corrigan knew he hadn't. He'd come to a complete stop, a habit drilled into him by years of operational driving. But he also knew arguing was pointless. "I apologize, officer. I must have been distracted." Carter didn't respond. Instead, his gaze drifted to the small, unassuming pin on the truck's sun visor. It was a gold trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs. Small, discreet, something only someone who knew what it was would recognize. Carter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "This your truck?" he asked, the question's implication hanging in the air. "Yes, sir, it is." "You in the military?" "Yes, officer, United States Navy." Corrigan kept his hands on the wheel. He'd been through dozens of these stops overseas, at checkpoints manned by nervous soldiers with twitchy trigger fingers. He knew the dance. Stay calm, be respectful. Don't give them a reason. Carter tapped the trident insignia on Corrigan's license, which indicated his veteran status. "Says here you're a veteran. That's different from being active duty." "My home of record is still my parents' house in Texas, sir. My license is issued here, but I'm active duty, stationed at Little Creek." Carter was silent for a long moment, just looking at him. It wasn't the look of a police officer conducting a traffic stop. It was a look of appraisal, of deep, penetrating suspicion. He saw the short, military-style haircut, the calm demeanor, the physical condition of a man who was clearly an athlete. But something in his mind wasn't connecting. "What's your rank?" Carter asked, the question sharp like an accusation. "Lieutenant, sir." "A lieutenant in the Navy SEALs," Carter repeated slowly, drawing the words out as if they tasted strange. You look a little young to be an officer in the teams." Corrigan didn't say anything. He was 34, a graduate of the Naval Academy with a decade of service and multiple combat deployments under his belt. He had led men into situations Carter couldn't imagine. But on the side of this empty highway, none of that mattered. "You have your military ID on you?" Carter demanded. "Yes, sir. It's in my wallet, which you're holding." Carter flipped open the worn leather wallet. He pulled out the common access card, the standard-issue military ID. He stared at the photo, then back at Corrigan. He examined the holographic seal, the embedded chip, the rank and name printed clearly. Lieutenant Michael Corrigan, U.S. Navy. The card was irrefutable proof. For a normal officer, this would have been the end of it. A warning, maybe a ticket, and on his way. But for Officer Carter, it seemed to be the beginning. He held the card up, angling it in the sun. "These are easy to fake," he said, his voice low. A cold knot formed in Corrigan's stomach. This wasn't about a stop sign. This was about something else entirely. He had seen this before in his own line of work. A man who has already made up his mind and is now just searching for facts to fit his conclusion. "Officer," Corrigan said, his voice still steady but with a new edge of caution. "That is a federally issued active-duty military identification card. It is not fake." "That's what someone with a fake ID would say," Carter retorted, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned closer to the window, his presence filling the space. "You know, we have a real problem in this country with stolen valor. Guys who never served, walking around pretending to be heroes. Buying gear online, making up stories. It makes me sick." He looked from the ID back to Corrigan. "So why don't you tell me the truth? Where'd you really get this?" The accusation was so outrageous, so profoundly insulting, that for a moment Corrigan was stunned into silence. He thought of his teammates who had died. He thought of the sacrifices, the years of pain and training, the quiet, anonymous work done in the dark corners of the world. And now, on a sun-bleached highway in his own country, he was being accused of being a fraud by a man who had no concept of what that service meant. The calm he had maintained began to fray, replaced by a cold, controlled anger. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice dropping, each word precise. "I am a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I have served for 12 years. I am not impersonating anyone." Carter's smirk vanished, replaced by a hard glare. He had pushed, and he had gotten a reaction. In his mind, it was confirmation. "I think you are," he said, stepping back from the vehicle. "And I think you need to step out of the truck. Now." The command was absolute. "Step out of the truck." It wasn't a request. The politeness of the traffic stop had evaporated, replaced by the raw, undisguised threat of force. Corrigan's mind raced, assessing the tactical situation out of pure instinct. One officer, open terrain, civilian setting, no immediate threat. But the officer was agitated, his judgment clouded by a bizarre and baseless suspicion. Escalating was a fatal error. Complying was the only survivable option. "Sir, I'm not sure what the issue is, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you have," Corrigan said, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. He was trying to give Carter an out, a way to de-escalate without losing face. "The issue is I think you're a liar," Carter snapped back, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his sidearm. The gesture was unmistakable. "I'm not going to ask you again. Get out of the vehicle, slowly." Corrigan took a slow breath, centering himself. "Okay," he said. He opened the door and stepped out, moving with a fluid economy of motion that spoke of years of training. He stood by his truck, hands away from his body, palms slightly open. He was taller than Carter, broader in the shoulders, but he made a conscious effort to seem less intimidating. The heat from the asphalt radiated up through the soles of his boots. The air was still, the only sound the hum of a distant semi-truck and the crackle of Carter's police radio. "Turn around. Place your hands on the truck," Carter commanded. Corrigan complied, placing his palms flat against the hot metal of his F-150's roof. He could see his own reflection in the tinted window, a distorted image of a man in a plain t-shirt and jeans, now in a position of submission. "My military ID is real," Corrigan stated, his voice muffled against the truck. "My commanding officer's contact information is in my wallet. You can call my duty station at Naval Special Warfare Development Group. They will verify my status in 60 seconds. "Oh, I'm sure they will," Carter said mockingly as he began a pat-down. His hands were rough, unprofessional. It wasn't a search for weapons, it was a search for justification. He pulled Corrigan's phone from his pocket and tossed it onto the truck's passenger seat. He found nothing else. A real SEAL wouldn't be running his mouth like this. He'd show respect. The irony was staggering. Corrigan had shown nothing but respect, while Carter had shown nothing but contempt from the moment he saw the trident. "I am showing you respect, officer. I'm also telling you the truth. You are making a serious mistake." Carter finished the pat-down and stepped back. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could get away with it. People died for the right to be called a Navy SEAL. You think you can just buy a pin and pretend?" This was the heart of it. For Carter, this wasn't about law enforcement. It was a personal crusade. He saw himself as a guardian against phonies, a protector of military honor. And in his twisted worldview, Michael Corrigan, a decorated officer with a decade of combat experience, was the enemy. The man in front of him didn't fit his cinematic image of a hero. A car slowed as it passed them, the driver's face a mask of curiosity. A witness. Then another. The world hadn't stopped. It was watching. "I have my deployment orders in my duffel bag on the passenger seat," Corrigan said, his patience stretched to its absolute limit. "They have my name, my rank, my unit. They're official Department of Defense documents. Let me show them to you." "You're not showing me anything," Carter said. He pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the oppressive heat. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Corrigan demanded, the disbelief sharp in his voice. "For a rolling stop you claim I made, or for serving in the military?" "For impersonating a military officer," Carter declared, as if he'd just solved a major crime, "and for failing to comply." He grabbed Corrigan's wrist, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Corrigan didn't resist. His training screamed at him that a physical confrontation with an armed police officer in this state of mind would end with him dead on the side of the road. He could defeat the man easily, but he couldn't defeat the badge and the gun. He let his muscles go slack, allowing Carter to cuff him. The cold steel bit into his skin. "You have the right to remain silent," Carter began, reciting the Miranda warning in a tone dripping with satisfaction. Every word was another layer of humiliation. Corrigan stared straight ahead, focusing on the horizon, the heat haze making the distant mesas tremble. He thought of his father, lying in a hospital bed, waiting for a son who was now being treated like a criminal. As Carter pushed him toward the back of the cruiser, a pickup truck slowed to a crawl on the opposite shoulder. An older man with a weathered face and a USMC veteran cap leaned out the window. "Hey, trooper," he yelled. "You might want to think about what you're doing. That man has the bearing of a real operator. I know it when I see it." Carter ignored him, shoving Corrigan into the back of the patrol car. The cage was cramped, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. He slammed the door, shutting out the world. Through the bars and the thick plexiglass, Corrigan watched Carter walk back to his truck. He saw him pick up the military ID again, still looking at it as if trying to will it into being a fake. He saw the Marine veteran pull away, shaking his head in disgust. The arrest was a fantasy, a complete fabrication built on one man's ego and prejudice. Corrigan had provided his name, his rank, his ID, his unit, and offered to provide official military orders. He had offered multiple avenues for immediate verification. Carter had rejected all of them. He had chosen this path. The cruiser's engine roared to life, and the car pulled back onto the highway, leaving Corrigan's F-150 abandoned on the shoulder. The drive to the county sheriff's office was silent. Carter didn't speak. Corrigan didn't either. There was nothing left to say. He was a prisoner in his own country, arrested for the very service he had dedicated his life to. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill. He had survived firefights in Afghanistan and hostage rescues off the coast of Somalia. He had faced down terrorists and warlords, but he had been utterly unprepared for the battle he would face on a lonely Texas highway against an enemy armed not with a rifle, but with a badge and a profound ignorance. The real fight, he understood with a chilling certainty, was just beginning. The Ector County Sheriff's Department was a low, sand-colored brick building that looked more like a community college than a jail. The air inside was frigid, a stark contrast to the inferno outside. The scent of institutional bleach and bureaucracy hung heavy. Officer Carter marched Corrigan through the main doors, one hand clamped firmly on his bicep, a display of control for the deputies milling around the central booking desk. 4 pairs of eyes looked up. They saw the cuffed man in civilian clothes, tall and silent, and the state trooper puffed up with self-importance. It was a common enough sight. But then their eyes lingered, and they saw something else. They saw the man's posture, the way he carried himself even in handcuffs. There was no fear, no desperation, only a cold, crystalline stillness. The booking sergeant sat behind a high counter, typing with 2 fingers on a worn keyboard. His nameplate read, Sergeant Frank Miller. He was a man in his late 50s, with a thick mustache that had gone completely gray and a frame that had softened since his time in the service, but his eyes were sharp. They missed nothing. He didn't look up immediately, letting the trooper stand there and wait. "Got one for you, Frank," Carter announced, his voice a little too loud. "Caught this one out on 87, impersonating a military officer. Navy SEAL, if you can believe it." At the words Navy SEAL, Miller's typing stopped. He lifted his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over Carter, then settling on Corrigan. He looked at Corrigan's face, his haircut, his bearing. It was a look that took less than 3 seconds, but in that time, Miller's 20 years as a Marine Force Recon gunnery sergeant conducted a full, silent assessment. He'd trained with SEALs. He'd fought alongside them. He knew what they looked like. They looked exactly like the man standing in front of him. Miller's expression remained neutral, but a subtle shift occurred. The casual indifference was gone. "Is that so?" he said, his voice a low gravel. He stood up, a movement that was surprisingly fluid for a man his size, and walked around the counter. He ignored Carter completely and addressed Corrigan directly. "What's your name, son?" he asked. There was no condescension in his tone. It was a question from one professional to another. "Lieutenant Michael Corrigan, sir," Corrigan replied. Miller nodded slightly. He looked at Carter. "Let me see his ID." Carter, flustered by being sidelined, handed over Corrigan's wallet and the military CAC card. "It's probably a fake, Sarge. A good one, but—" Miller cut him off with a look. He took the CAC card and held it, not up to the light, but just feeling the weight and texture of it. He'd handled his own for 2 decades. He knew what a real one felt like. He looked at the photo, then back at Corrigan's face. He saw the embedded chip. He glanced at the rank. Lieutenant 03. Believable for a man in his mid-30s. He then looked at the blue and white state trooper. "You verify this?" Miller asked, his voice flat. "The guy was lippy," Carter said defensively. "He couldn't answer basic questions. His story didn't add up." Corrigan remained silent. He knew an ally when he saw one. Sergeant Miller was now in control. Miller turned his back on Carter and walked to the phone on his desk. "What unit did you say you were with, Lieutenant?" "Naval Special Warfare Development Group," Corrigan said. Miller's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. DevGru, SEAL Team 6. He knew the name, and he knew they didn't let just anyone in. He picked up the phone's receiver and began dialing. "What are you doing?" Carter demanded. "My job," Miller said without looking at him. He found the number for the command duty officer at Dam Neck. He put the call on speakerphone. The whole booking area went quiet. The other deputies stopped their shuffling of papers and watched. They knew Miller. They knew he didn't suffer fools. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Petty Officer on watch." "This is Sergeant Frank Miller with the Ector County Sheriff's Department in Texas," Miller said calmly. "I need to perform a status check on one of your personnel, Lieutenant Michael Corrigan." He read the service number off the back of the CAC card. "Stand by," the voice said. The only sound in the room was the soft tapping of a keyboard coming through the speakerphone. The seconds stretched out, each one tightening the invisible screws on Officer Carter. He shifted his weight, his arrogance visibly deflating, replaced by a growing unease. He seemed to realize for the first time that he was no longer the one in charge of the situation. "Sergeant," the voice came back sharp and clear, "Lieutenant Corrigan is an active-duty SEAL officer assigned to this command. He is currently on authorized emergency leave to attend to a family matter. Sir, his record is exemplary. May I ask the nature of this inquiry? Is the lieutenant all right?" Miller's eyes were locked on Carter. The younger officer's face had gone pale. "He's fine, petty officer," Miller said, his voice like stone. "He was detained by a state trooper under suspicion of impersonating an officer." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Then the voice, no longer just professional but laced with cold fury, spoke again. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, I think I misheard you. Did you say he was arrested?" "That's affirmative," Miller said. Another silence, this one longer, more ominous. "Sergeant Miller, on behalf of this command, I need you to understand that you are holding one of our decorated combat officers. We are taking this matter with the utmost seriousness. A Judge Advocate General representative will be in contact with your office within the hour." The line went dead. Miller slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click echoed in the silent room. He turned to face Carter, his expression unreadable but radiating a quiet, dangerous anger. He picked up the handcuff key from his desk, walked over to Corrigan, and unlocked the cuffs. The metal fell away. Corrigan rubbed his wrists, the red marks stark against his skin. He looked at Miller and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. "Lieutenant, on behalf of law enforcement in this county, I apologize," Miller said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "This never should have happened." He then turned his full attention to Carter, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Carter," Miller's voice was low, but it cut through the room like a razor. "You are an embarrassment. You didn't see a criminal. You saw a uniform you felt you had a right to question, and your ego got in the way of your brain. You had the proof in your hand and you ignored it." He pointed a thick finger toward a chair against the wall. "Sit down, don't speak, and wait for your supervisor. He's going to want to have a very long talk with you. Your day just went from bad to worse." The phone call from the DevGru duty officer was not an end. It was a trigger. It set off a chain reaction that moved with the terrifying speed and efficiency unique to the American military's command structure. The petty officer didn't just hang up and file a report. He immediately notified his command master chief. The master chief, a man who viewed his operators as his own sons, walked directly into the office of the squadron's commanding officer, a Navy captain, and relayed the information without ceremony. The captain's face, normally calm and analytical, hardened into a mask of cold fury. An arrest was one thing. An arrest for impersonating one of his own men was a direct insult to his entire command. Within 10 minutes, that captain was on a secure line to the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Within 30 minutes, the admiral in charge of all SEAL teams was being briefed. An hour after Corrigan had walked into the booking room, the news landed on the desk of the Chief of Naval Operations at the Pentagon. The situation was no longer a local police matter in a forgotten corner of Texas. It was a federal issue involving an active-duty special operations officer being unlawfully detained, and the U.S. Navy was mobilizing for battle. Simultaneously, a parallel cascade was occurring within the legal branch. The DevGru Command contacted their Staff Judge Advocate General, JAG, lawyer. That lawyer immediately called the head of Navy Legal Service Command. From there, the alert went straight to the office of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy. The top lawyers in the service were now aware that one of their decorated officers had been stripped of his rights by a civilian police officer. The language they used was precise and damning. Unlawful apprehension, deprivation of rights under color of law, a potential violation of the Posse Comitatus Act's spirit, and a gross insult to the armed forces. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, a high-priority meeting was convened in a secure conference room at the Pentagon. The decision was swift and unanimous. This would not be handled quietly. An example had to be made. The Department of the Navy would fully cooperate with a Department of Justice investigation, which they would demand be opened immediately. A public affairs statement was to be drafted, expressing the Navy's outrage and unwavering support for their officer. And a senior JAG Corps litigator from Washington, D.C. was to be dispatched on the next flight to Texas to act as Corrigan's personal counsel and to liaise with federal prosecutors. The full weight of the United States military's legal and institutional power was now aimed at one state trooper, Officer Ben Carter. While the gears of federal power began to grind in Washington, a quieter, more human drama was playing out back in Texas. Sergeant Miller didn't just release Michael Corrigan. He understood that the damage was more than just a wrongful arrest. It was a deep and personal violation. After Carter's supervisor arrived and a visibly shaken Carter was sequestered in an office to write a report he could not possibly justify, Miller turned to Corrigan. "Where's your truck, Lieutenant?" "On the shoulder of 87, about 30 miles east of here." "Give me the keys," Miller said. "I'll have a deputy retrieve it and bring it to your parents' house. You've been through enough today. I'm driving you home." Corrigan hesitated for a moment, then nodded and handed over his keys. He was exhausted, the adrenaline of the encounter fading into a bone-deep weariness. They walked out of the station, not through the public front entrance, but through a back door. Miller led him to his personal vehicle, an aging but well-kept pickup truck. The ride was mostly silent. The flat, sun-scorched landscape rolled past the windows. Corrigan finally broke the silence. "Thank you, Sergeant." "No thanks needed," Miller replied, his eyes on the road. "I was a gunny for 20 years in the Corps, saw action in Fallujah. I know the difference between a real warrior and a wannabe. That kid Carter, he's got a badge and a gun, but he's playing an angle. He's the one who's impersonating something. He's impersonating a real cop." They drove on, and Miller spoke again, this time more softly. "My own son is in the Army, Ranger Battalion. He's deployed right now. The thought of some punk officer treating him like that because he can't tell the difference, it makes my blood boil." He glanced over at Corrigan. "What Carter did today wasn't just about you. He disrespected everyone who's ever worn the uniform. He'll have to answer for that." When they pulled into the driveway of the small ranch-style house Corrigan had grown up in, his mother was standing on the porch, her face etched with worry. She had been calling his phone for hours with no answer. Corrigan got out of the truck, and the relief that washed over her face was quickly replaced by confusion as she saw the sheriff's department vehicle pull up behind them with Corrigan's F-150. Corrigan embraced his mother, a long, quiet hug that said more than words could. Miller got out of his truck and walked over. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said to Corrigan's mother, "your son is a hero. I'm sorry for what our community put him through today. It won't be forgotten." As Miller prepared to leave, Corrigan stopped him. "Sergeant Miller, Frank, why did you help me? You could have just looked the other way." Miller put his hat back on and looked him square in the eye. "Because we're on the same side, Lieutenant. And if we don't stand up for our own, who will? Go be with your father." He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Corrigan standing in the driveway of his childhood home. He was free, but the events of the day felt like a stain that wouldn't wash out. He had come home to fight a private battle with family grief, only to be dragged into a public war he never asked for. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who understood conflict, that the war had just begun. Before Sergeant Miller had even driven Michael Corrigan home, the fuse on a digital powder keg had been lit. The Marine veteran in the pickup truck, The one who had yelled at Officer Carter from the side of the road hadn't just driven off in disgust. His name was Earl Jones, a 68-year-old retired rancher who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. When he saw the trooper cuffing a man who carried himself with the unmistakable discipline of a professional soldier, he did what millions of people now do instinctively. He pulled out his smartphone. His recording started shaky, catching the end of the arrest, the forced march to the cruiser, and Carter ignoring his shouted warning. But it also captured something crucial, a crystal-clear shot of Corrigan, standing tall and composed even in handcuffs, and the trooper's dismissive, arrogant demeanor. Earl went home, his anger simmering. He uploaded the 2-minute clip to his Facebook page with a simple, powerful caption. "Saw this on Highway 87 today. State trooper arresting a military man who did nothing wrong. This ain't right. Spread the word." Earl had 247 friends. Within an hour, the video had been shared over 1,000 times. A local veterans group in Odessa picked it up. From there, it jumped to a statewide Texas Veterans Network. By evening, it had escaped the confines of Facebook and was rocketing across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The algorithm, sensing outrage and engagement, began pushing it into millions of feeds. The first headlines were raw and unverified. "Cop arrests soldier on Texas highway." But as the story spread, details began to leak. Someone who knew someone at the sheriff's department confirmed the man arrested was a Navy SEAL. The narrative solidified, becoming more potent with every share. Texas State Trooper arrests Navy SEAL for impersonating an officer. By the next morning, it was a national story. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC were all playing the grainy cell phone footage on a loop. Military news outlets like Task and Purpose and Military.com ran detailed stories. The video was dissected frame by frame. Pundits and commentators weighed in, their opinions split along predictable lines. Some defended the officer, citing the need to be vigilant against stolen valor. But the overwhelming majority of the public, especially the massive and vocal veteran community, was incensed. For them, the video was a visceral betrayal. They saw in Michael Corrigan every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who had ever put on a uniform. They saw the quiet professionalism, the disciplined compliance in the face of disrespect. And in Officer Carter, they saw a petty tyrant abusing the authority they had sworn to uphold the laws of. Veterans organizations, which normally move with bureaucratic slowness, responded with astonishing speed. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW, and the American Legion issued a joint statement demanding a full federal investigation and the immediate termination of Officer Carter. The Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, IAVA, started a petition calling for new legislation to protect service members from this kind of harassment, gathering over 100,000 signatures in 24 hours. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForCorrigan and #SupportOurTroopers, with the second word deliberately aimed at Carter, trended nationally. The pressure was immense, and it was coming from every direction. The Texas Department of Public Safety was inundated with furious phone calls and emails. The governor's office released a statement promising a thorough and transparent review. But the narrative was no longer theirs to control. The story was now being told not just by news anchors, but by thousands of service members and veterans sharing their own experiences. Stories poured out online about being questioned in airports, hassled in bars, and pulled over by police who were suspicious of their military IDs or license plates. Corrigan's arrest had become a symbol for a deeper, simmering resentment. The feeling that the civilian world, which they had sworn to protect, often neither understood nor respected their sacrifice. It was a cultural flashpoint, exposing a raw nerve in the American psyche. Back in his hometown, Corrigan was trying to insulate his family from the storm. He sat by his father's bedside, holding his hand, the national debate a distant noise. But it kept intruding. His phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from reporters, producers, and even publishing agents. He ignored them all. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to become a cause célèbre. He just wanted to be a son. But the world wouldn't let him. One evening, he sat with his mother watching the local news. A reporter was standing in front of the Ector County Sheriff's Department. Then, the grainy footage from Earl Jones's phone filled the screen. His mother gasped, seeing her son in handcuffs for the first time. The humiliation of that moment, now broadcast for the world to see, was a fresh wound. "They're making it sound like you're a hero for this," his mother said, her voice trembling. Corrigan looked at the television, at the endless loop of his own debasement. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy, "there's nothing heroic about being put on your knees. The heroism is in how you get back up." He knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The fight was no longer just his. It belonged to every person who had ever been judged, dismissed, and disrespected by someone in a position of power. The firestorm was raging, and soon he would have to walk into the heart of it. The public and military outcry was so immediate and overwhelming that it forced the hand of the justice system. What might have been a slow-moving internal affairs investigation was ripped out of the hands of the Texas Department of Public Safety before it even began. By Monday morning, less than 48 hours after the arrest, the United States Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division was opening a federal investigation into the incident. The FBI's Dallas field office was assigned the lead. This changed the entire game. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was about the fundamental civil rights of a U.S. citizen, and the federal government was bringing its full investigative power to bear. 2 FBI special agents, a man and a woman who projected an aura of calm, implacable competence, flew into West Texas. Their first stop was not the state police, but Sergeant Frank Miller at the Ector County Sheriff's Office. Miller gave them a full, unvarnished account of what he had witnessed, his testimony carrying the weight of a man with unimpeachable integrity. He handed over the booking room's security footage, which clearly showed Carter's bravado collapsing into panic during the phone call to DevGru. Next, the agents interviewed Michael Corrigan at his parents' home. The conversation was quiet, respectful. Corrigan, with the JAG officer from D.C. now by his side, recounted the events with the precision of an after-action report. He presented the facts without emotion, letting them speak for themselves. The agents listened, their faces betraying nothing, but they recognized the ring of truth. Their most crucial task, however, was to get inside the head of Officer Ben Carter. They subpoenaed his entire personnel file from the Texas DPS, a file that on the surface looked unremarkable. Carter, age 36, had been a trooper for 8 years. He had average performance reviews, a few minor commendations for traffic enforcement. But the agents were trained to look for patterns, for the things written between the lines. They started with the complaints. There were 3 in his file. All had been dismissed by his superiors as unfounded. The first was from a young Army Ranger who complained Carter had detained him for nearly an hour at a gas station, repeatedly questioning the validity of his military ID. The second was from a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who alleged Carter had been verbally abusive during a traffic stop, making disparaging remarks about his desk jockey service. The third was from a young Marine who claimed Carter had pulled him over for no reason and searched his car, telling him that his military-themed license plate made him a target. Individually, the complaints had been brushed aside. A he said, a misunderstanding, an officer having a bad day. But together, laid out on a table in an FBI field office, they formed a chilling mosaic. This wasn't a random incident. Officer Carter had a history, a clear and documented pattern of hostility and unwarranted suspicion directed specifically at members of the military. He wasn't a guardian of stolen valor. He was a predator who used his badge to bully the very people he should have respected most. The agents dug deeper, interviewing Carter's former colleagues and his commanding officer. A picture emerged of a man who was deeply insecure. They learned that Carter had tried to join the Marines after high school, but had washed out of boot camp in his 3rd week due to a failure to adapt. He never tried another branch. Instead, He drifted through a few jobs before joining the State Police Academy, where he excelled. The uniform and the authority of law enforcement seemed to be a compensation for the military uniform he could never earn. He harbored a deep-seated resentment, a toxic envy of the men who had succeeded where he had failed. The trident on Corrigan's visor, the rank of officer, the calm authority, it had all triggered that buried sense of inadequacy and transformed it into aggression. The FBI also collected every piece of digital evidence. They got the raw, unedited footage from Carter's dashcam and bodycam. They tracked down Earl Jones, the Marine veteran, and got the original high-definition version of his cell phone video. They found 2 other drivers who had passed by and recorded snippets of the arrest. When they synced all the footage together, they had a comprehensive multi-angle view of the entire encounter. The video evidence was damning. It showed Corrigan's compliance. It showed his repeated, calm attempts to de-escalate and provide proof of his identity. And it showed Carter's escalating aggression, his refusal to listen to reason, his clear decision to ignore the evidence in front of him. The body cam in particular was devastating. The audio captured every word, every sneering insinuation Carter made, every respectful "sir" Corrigan offered in return. It was the story of the arrest, told not by witnesses, but by the perpetrator himself. With a mountain of evidence and a clear pattern of behavior established, the FBI agents and the DOJ prosecutor knew they had more than just a case of a wrongful arrest. They had a case for a federal hate crime, not based on race or religion, but on the victim's status as a member of the armed forces. It was a novel legal strategy, but they believed the flagrant nature of Carter's actions and his documented history made it a charge they could make stick. 1 week after the arrest, armed with a federal warrant, FBI agents arrived at Officer Ben Carter's home. He was suspended with pay, pending the outcome of the investigation. They arrested him not for impersonating an officer, but for violating one. The charges were read: deprivation of rights under color of law and commission of a hate crime. The hunter had become the hunted. The trial of Benjamin Carter versus the United States of America began 4 months later at the federal courthouse in Austin. The case had become a national obsession, and the courtroom was packed every day. On one side sat a row of stoic, uniformed Navy SEALs who had flown in from Virginia to support their brother in arms. On the other, a small contingent of police union representatives, their faces grim. In the gallery, veterans in faded caps sat next to reporters from every major news network. It was more than a trial, it was a reckoning. Michael Corrigan attended every day, sitting in the front row with his mother and the Navy JAG officer. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit, not his uniform. This was not a military tribunal. He was here as a citizen whose rights had been violated, and he wanted the jury to see him as such. The prosecution, led by a sharp, relentless assistant U.S. attorney named Maria Flores, built their case with methodical precision. They weren't just trying to prove that Carter had made a mistake, they were trying to prove that he had acted with malicious intent, driven by a specific prejudice against members of the military. Their first and most powerful witness was Officer Carter himself, through the lens of his own body camera. Flores played the entire 34-minute recording for the jury on a massive screen. They saw the traffic stop. They heard Carter's voice, dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. They saw Corrigan's military ID held up to the camera, the details clear and undeniable. They heard Corrigan's calm, repeated offers to provide verification, and they heard Carter dismiss them all. "These are easy to fake," Carter's voice echoed in the silent courtroom. The footage was excruciating. Carter's defense attorney could only watch as his client's own words and actions systematically destroyed his credibility. Next, Flores called an expert on military identification from the Department of Defense. The expert walked the jury through the multiple security features of a common access card, the holographic laminate, the embedded microchip, the specific fonts and placement that were nearly impossible to counterfeit. He concluded, "To a trained eye, the authenticity of Lieutenant Corrigan's ID is not just likely, It is self-evident. Then, Sergeant Frank Miller took the stand. In his crisp sheriff's uniform, he was the picture of quiet authority. He described the moment Corrigan was brought into his booking room. "I knew in 5 seconds he was military," Miller testified. "It's in the posture, the eyes, the way he handles himself under pressure." Flores asked, "And what did you do when you had doubts about Officer Carter's assessment?" "I did what any reasonable officer would do," Miller said, his gaze steady. "I made a phone call. It took 90 seconds. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine Miller, suggesting he was biased because of his own military background. Miller's response was ice cold. "My bias is towards the truth, counselor. And the truth that day was standing in handcuffs while the liar was wearing a badge." The prosecution also brought the 3 other service members who had filed complaints against Carter. One by one, the Army Ranger, the Air Force vet, and the young Marine told their stories. Each one was a different verse of the same song. A routine stop, an officer immediately hostile and suspicious, an obsession with the idea that they were frauds. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a one-time error in judgment, it was a compulsion. When Michael Corrigan was finally called to testify, a hush fell over the courtroom. He walked to the stand, his steps measured and confident. Speaking in a clear, steady voice, he recounted the events of that day on the highway. He didn't embellish or display anger. He simply stated the facts. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Corrigan as arrogant, as someone who thought his military status put him above the law. "Lieutenant," the attorney began, "isn't it true that you were argumentative with my client?" "No, sir. I was compliant. I answered every question truthfully." "But you questioned his authority, didn't you? You told him he was making a mistake." "I informed him of the facts, sir," Corrigan corrected him gently. "I told him he was arresting an active-duty naval officer without cause. That wasn't a challenge to his authority. It was a statement of fact, which I repeatedly offered to help him verify." The attorney tried a different tack. "Being a Navy SEAL, that's an elite group. You're trained to be aggressive, to take control. Did your training kick in that day?" Corrigan paused, looking directly at the jury. "Yes, sir, it did," he said. "My training taught me how to assess a threat. It taught me how to de-escalate a volatile situation. It taught me that when a man is acting irrationally and holding a gun, you do exactly what he says to survive the encounter. My training is the reason I am alive to testify here today." The answer hung in the air, a stunning rebuke of the defense's entire narrative. The attorney had no more questions. The jury, which included 2 veterans, deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Benjamin Carter sat motionless, his face pale and slack, as his life was irrevocably altered. Michael Corrigan closed his eyes for a moment, a single deep breath escaping his lips. It wasn't a victory. It was a validation. A quiet, solemn confirmation that in a courtroom, at least, the truth still mattered. 2 weeks later, the same courtroom was filled for the sentencing. Benjamin Carter, now stripped of his uniform and dressed in a baggy county jail jumpsuit, stood before the judge. The judge, a woman known for her stern demeanor and sharp legal mind, had served in the U.S. Army JAG Corps before her appointment to the federal bench. She looked down at Carter not just as a judge, but as someone who understood the institution he had so cavalierly disrespected. Her sentencing statement was not a dry recitation of legal statutes. It was a 10-minute dissection of his failure. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice cold and clear, "you were entrusted with a badge and a gun, symbols of public trust. You were given the authority to enforce the law, but you did not see the law that day. You did not see a citizen or a veteran or a naval officer. You saw a reflection of your own personal failures and resentments. You saw a uniform you could not earn, so you chose to defile it. You humiliated a man who has risked his life for this country, not because he broke the law, but because he represented something you could never be." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The evidence shows this was not an error. It was a pattern, It was a choice repeated over and over again. You chose to ignore the proof in your hands. You chose to reject every offer of verification. You chose to abuse your power. This court must send a message that such a betrayal of public trust will not be tolerated. The sentence of this court is 15 years in a federal penitentiary. A gasp went through the courtroom. 15 years. It was more than anyone had expected. Carter's knees seemed to buckle slightly. He was led away in chains, a convicted felon, his career in law enforcement over, his life as he knew it shattered. The verdict and the harsh sentence sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. In the months that followed, the aftermath of the case continued to unfold. The Texas Department of Public Safety publicly fired Carter and issued a formal apology to the U.S. Navy and to Michael Corrigan. The civil lawsuit filed by Corrigan against the state was settled out of court for a record-breaking $7.5 million. When asked by reporters what he would do with the money, Corrigan's response was simple. "I'm creating a foundation that provides free legal aid to service members and veterans who have had their civil rights violated." The case also led to tangible change. Spurred by lobbying from veterans groups and testimony from Corrigan himself before the House Armed Services Committee, Congress passed the Service Member Verification Act. The new federal law mandated that if a law enforcement officer questions the validity of an active duty military ID, they must take reasonable steps to verify it through official channels before making an arrest for impersonation. Carter's body cam footage became mandatory viewing in police academies nationwide, a powerful training tool on what not to do. Today, 3 years later, Michael Corrigan is a commander in the Navy, his career unmarred by the incident. He continues to serve, his commitment to his country unshaken, perhaps even deepened. Benjamin Carter is in his 3rd year of a 15-year sentence at a medium-security federal prison. Sergeant Frank Miller was promoted to lieutenant and now heads up the training division for his department, where he has instituted a new program focused on de-escalation and respectful interaction with military veterans. The digital and legal echoes of that hot Texas afternoon have reshaped policy and ruined one man's life. But the questions it raised remain. The heart of this tragedy lies not in a system, but in the insecurity of a single man. What drove Officer Ben Carter? His actions weren't born from a desire for justice, but from a deep-seated envy. Having failed to become a Marine, he spent his life adjacent to the world he desperately wanted to join. He saw in Lieutenant Corrigan everything he was not. A validated, respected member of an elite warrior class. His badge didn't give him a sense of service, it gave him a tool to exercise power over the very men he envied. The stop on the highway wasn't an investigation, it was a pathetic attempt to tear down a symbol of his own failure. He needed to prove that the hero was a fraud, because if Corrigan was fake, it made his own inadequacy easier to bear. Could Lieutenant Corrigan have done anything differently? It's a painful question to ask the victim, but a necessary one. If he had argued more forcefully, would Carter have backed down? Or would he have perceived it as aggression and escalated to deadly force? If he had simply remained silent, would it have been seen as an admission of guilt? The chilling truth is that Corrigan did everything right. He followed the textbook procedure for surviving an encounter with an irrational armed authority figure. The lesson here is not for the victim, but for the system. The burden of de-escalation should not fall on the citizen who is being unjustly targeted. The onus must be on the officer wielding the power. What if Sergeant Miller hadn't been on duty that day? What if his Marine Corps background hadn't given him the immediate clarity to see the truth? Without that one man of integrity, Corrigan's life could have been derailed, buried under a false report, and a system inclined to believe its own. The ultimate lesson from this case is one of character. A badge, a uniform, a set of medals, they are all external. They are symbols of something earned, but they are not the substance of the person wearing them. Carter wore the uniform of the law but lacked the character of a true officer. Corrigan, even stripped of his freedom and dignity on the side of a road, never lost the character of a leader. This story is a stark reminder that true authority comes not from a position of power, but from a foundation of integrity. And when those in power lack that integrity, it is not just an individual who suffers, but the trust that holds our entire society together. What do you think? When does a police officer's healthy skepticism cross the line into a destructive personal bias? And what is the single most important change that needs to happen in police training to prevent incidents like this? Drop your answers in the comments below, and if this story matters to you, hit subscribe. We need to keep paying attention.